a man, a corrupt world,
An impossible mission.
120 years building, without anyone believing him. One door, 8 people inside, the rest of the world outside. And then the water came. What happened in the next 7 days has no parallel in human history. 5 millennia ago, when humanity was young but already deeply sick, a man chose a different path from everyone around him. He was not a king. He had no armies or political power. He was a father, a husband, a builder. And yet, his decision to remain faithful changed the course of human history forever. His name was Noah. And this is the story of the door that God himself closed. The world into which Noah was born looked nothing like the world we know today. It was older, more violent, and in certain ways more terrifying. Human beings lived hundreds of years, which means that wickedness did not dwell only in ephemeral hearts, but in wills that had spent centuries perfecting their cruelty. When Noah's father, Lamech, gave that name to his newborn son, he did so with a hope heavy with pain. This one will bring us comfort, relieving us from our work and the pain of our hands. It was an earth that desperately needed comfort, and Lamech knew it. But the comfort would take time to arrive, because first would come the greatest storm the world would ever see. Noah grew up in an environment where violence was not the exception, but the very fabric of daily life. The roads were dominated by creatures the ancient texts call Nephilim, sons of an unnatural union between rebellious angels and human women. They were not legends. They were men of flesh and blood, but of proportions and strength that no normal human being could match. The Bible describes them as mighty ones and men of fame, words that in that context did not mean admiration, but terror. Wherever the Nephilim appeared, people disappeared, burned, and fear settled in like a permanent guest. And if the Nephilim were the most visible expression of that wickedness, they were not the root. The root was older and deeper. A long time ago, an angel had chosen rebellion over loyalty, and dragging others of his kind with him, had turned the earth into a testing ground for chaos. Satan, the devil, and his allies did not destroy directly, at least not always. They did something more effective. They corrupted, they influenced, they sowed in the human mind the idea that God was unnecessary, that his limits were arbitrary, that strength and pleasure were the only real values. The result was devastating. Jehovah himself looked upon that earth, and the sacred record says that every inclination of the thoughts of man's heart was only bad all the time, not some thoughts, not most, all the time. In that world lived Noah. What made him different was not that he was perfect. It was that he chose, day after day, in the midst of that environment saturated with corruption, to walk in a different direction. The Bible describes him with 3 phrases that together form the most complete portrait that could be made of a human being. Noah was a righteous man. He proved himself faultless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with the true God, walking with God, in a world where no one else did, in a world where doing so made you the laughingstock of the powerful and a stranger to those who simply went with the flow. Noah did not have a community of believers to back him up in difficult times. He had no temples or institutions. He had his family, He had his conscience, and he had a relationship so real with Jehovah that the text describe it as walking together like two friends who know each other well and trust one another. That intimacy with God was his strength, and it would also be his greatest test, because Jehovah had not closed his eyes to what was happening. And one day, that walk alongside Noah took a direction that none of his contemporaries could have anticipated. He met his family after a day's work, with hands still rough from the dirt and the smell of the field clinging to his clothes. Or perhaps he was alone in the silence of the afternoon when God's voice arrived with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The words he heard that day changed his life forever, and indeed changed the destiny of all humanity. Jehovah spoke to him, and what he told him was so monumental, so absolutely outside any known frame of reference, that any other man might have collapsed under the weight of those words. The world was going to end. Not a village, not a region, the world, everything. And Noah had to build something, something enormous, something no one had ever built before, because water was coming. More water than any human being had ever seen, more water than any human eye could imagine. Noah listened, and he believed. That faith was not naivety. It was the result of years of knowing Jehovah intimately, of meditating on his character, of understanding that when God speaks, the words are not decorative. They are reality with a fulfillment date. Noah knew with the same certainty with which he knew the sun would rise the next day that what Jehovah had promised would happen. And so began what would be the most extraordinary task any human being has ever undertaken, a construction that would last decades, a preaching that would not produce a single visible convert, a faith that would have to sustain itself against the weight of mockery, incomprehension, and time. But at some point in that story, there would be a door that would open to receive 8 people and thousands of animals. And then that same door would close. Noah would not close it. His sons would not close it. Jehovah would close it. And in that instant, the time the world had had to act would come to an end. Why does that matter today? Why does that door, closed 5,000 years ago in a world that no longer exists, have something to tell us here, now? That is the question that will guide every moment of this story, and the answer will come. But first, we must experience the narrative from the inside. There is no way to prepare for a conversation with God. There is no protocol, no precedent that makes it predictable. Enoch, Noah's great-grandfather, had walked with Jehovah and had received messages that led him to proclaim judgments to a generation that did not want to listen. Noah knew that story. He had carried it with him like an inheritance, like a lit lamp in the midst of the darkness of his time. But knowing someone else's story does not cushion the impact when God's voice speaks directly to you. The words arrived without embellishment, without beating around the bush. Jehovah did not soften what he had to say. The end of all flesh has come before me, because the earth is full of violence as a result of them. And here I am about to bring them to ruin together with the earth. Noah listened. The weight of those words was not abstract. He knew that violence. He had seen it with his own eyes since he was a child, had dodged it on the roads, had explained it to his sons when they were little, and asked why the world was so cruel. God was not describing something foreign to him. He was putting a name to something Noah already knew deep in his being, that this could not go on forever. But what came next was something for which no prior experience could have prepared him. Make for yourself an ark of resinous wood, an ark. Jehovah gave him the instructions with a precision that left no room for personal interpretation. 133 meters long, 22 meters wide, 13 meters high, 3 decks, internal compartments, a door in the side, an opening along the top, with a roof elevated in the center, sloping to the sides so the water would drain, and everything coated inside and out with tar. Noah listened, and his mind was already doing calculations no human being had made before. How many trees? How much time? How many hands? And then God added what turned that colossal task into something even more solemn. I am going to bring the flood of waters upon the earth to ruin all flesh that has the breath of life in it. Everything that is in the earth will expire, and I will establish my covenant with you, and you will go into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. A covenant. Jehovah was not just giving him instructions. He was making him a promise, and that promise was the foundation upon which Noah would literally build for the next decades. That night, Noah told them everything. Let's imagine the scene. The family gathered, the flames of a bonfire casting long shadows on the faces of his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the women who had chosen them as husbands. 8 people around a fire, 8 people Noah loved, and for whose lives he would be responsible before God. We don't know exactly what words he used. The Bible doesn't record it, but it does record something more eloquent than any speech. Noah proceeded to do according to all that God had commanded him. He did just so. That phrase, seemingly simple, encloses decades of flawless obedience. He did just so. Not approximately, not with adjustments for convenience, not with modifications to make the task seem more reasonable in the eyes of his neighbors. Just so, and his family followed him. That was not something that happened by inertia. Noah had spent years, decades, cultivating an atmosphere in his home where God was real, where his words mattered, where righteousness was not a burden but an identity. His sons had grown up seeing a father who did not say one thing and do another, who did not preach justice in public and forget it in private. And when the most difficult moment came, when the father told them they were going to build something no one would understand, for a flood no one would believe in, following instructions from a God no one in their surroundings respected, they followed him. That was the result of years of walking with God within the walls of a home. The next day the work began. The sound of the axe against the cypress wood echoed for the first time in what would be, for decades, the soundtrack of their lives. The smell of fresh resin filled the morning air. Their muscles protested from the very first day, and from the very first day, the neighbors protested too. What are you building? What is that for? A flood? Water that covers the mountains? Are you crazy? Noah heard them and kept cutting wood, because he had something very few of his contemporaries possessed, the certainty that God had spoken. And that certainty was more solid than any human opinion, more resistant than any mockery, more durable than any argument against it. Noah's faith was not blind. It was the logical consequence of knowing Jehovah's character intimately. And whoever truly knows God does not need the world's permission to obey him. The ark began to grow, slowly, vigorously, stubbornly, and the world continued to pay no attention. The first year was the hardest, not because of the physical work, although that was brutal, but because there was not yet enough visible ark for anyone to understand what was happening. There were only stacked logs, foundations laid out on the dirt, and a family that woke up early when everyone else slept. Noah soon learned that building the ark and preaching about the flood were two different but equally exhausting tasks. With his hands he did one, with his voice he did the other, and both met the same response: indifference at first, mockery later, and in time something darker than mockery. When the wooden frame began to rise over the landscape, and it was impossible to ignore, people stopped laughing from a distance and started coming closer, not to help, to interrogate, to provoke, to try to get Noah to stop. The ones who intimidated the most were not the common neighbors, but the Nephilim, those colossal sons of the rebellious angels who watched the construction with the arrogance of those who are convinced nothing can threaten them. They had dominated the earth with their strength. What could water do to them? Noah looked at them and kept working. The scenes of those decades repeated themselves with variation on the same central theme. Noah standing before a group of men in the market, the smell of tar still on his hands, explaining what God had told him. Some walked away without answering. Others made comments that drew roars of laughter from bystanders. Sometimes a rock, sometimes a threat more concrete than words. But Noah did not preach to convince through debate. He preached because it was the right thing to do, because Jehovah had entrusted him not only to build but to warn. And even though none of his contemporaries changed their course, that preaching had a value that Noah perhaps did not fully grasp at the time. It proved that everyone had been given the opportunity, that no one could say later that they didn't know. On the ark, meanwhile, the work ran its course with the silent discipline of those who have a purpose greater than their comfort. Shem, the eldest son, dragged cypress logs with his back hunched under the weight. Ham learned to handle the axe with a precision his father had taught him since childhood. Japheth calculated the angles of the roof, the exact slope God had specified, so the water would run off without accumulating. The three daughters-in-law organized the interior, the compartments, the spaces where they would live for a time none of them could yet imagine accurately. And Noah's wife. The Bible doesn't tell us her name, but her presence weaves through every page of this story like an invisible, resilient thread. She chose to believe when it would have been easier to doubt. She chose to stay when it would have been simpler to walk away. She chose to work with her hands on something her neighbors considered a collective madness. Her faith had no prophets or direct visions. She had something that in certain respects is much harder, the faith to trust the man she loved, and through him, the God that man knew. Years passed. The ark grew. There were moments of expected beauty amidst the hardship. Afternoons when the sun fell on freshly cut wood, and the smell of cypress filled the air with a clean, powerful fragrance. Mornings when the family worked in silence, and that silence was a form of prayer. Nights when Noah looked at the massive structure rising against the sky and felt, not pride, but gratitude. Gratitude that God had chosen him. Gratitude that his family was with him. Gratitude that his faith, contrary to what the world claimed, had not destroyed him, but sustained him. And there were also losses. When Noah was over 500 years old, his father Lamech died. The man who had given him that name laden with hope, the one who had said, "This one will bring us comfort," passed away without seeing the flood, without seeing the finished ark, without seeing the fulfillment of the promise his son had received. Noah buried him with the silent grief of men who do not have time to dwell on it too much, but who tuck the loss away in some deep place where it won't interfere with the work. Methuselah had been born in an era Noah only knew from stories, had seen entire generations born and die, and now he was leaving just when the world he had known was about to disappear forever. With him went the last direct link to the early days. With him, an era closed. Noah stood alone in his generation, the last righteous man standing. But the ark was also almost finished. The tar now covered every joint, every crack, every internal and external surface, with a thick, black, waterproof layer that smelled strong under the midday sun. The compartments were built. The sloping roof let rainwater run off the sides. The door, large and solid, waited in the side of the ark like a mouth that had not yet spoken its final word.
If you enjoyed this content, subscribe so you don't miss the next inspiring Bible story.